Frank Zeidler was 36 when he was elected mayor in 1948, the last big city socialist mayor in America. Retired UWM professor Fred Olson knew the Zeidler family as a youngster. He attended high school at the same time as Frank. Later wrote his doctoral thesis on Milwaukee socialism and Frank Zeidler.
The 30s had a lot of fairly rough politics in which the socialists were torn between wanting to storm the barricades and create the revolution, and then the Zeidler contingency was obviously much more evolutionary, willing to take reform efforts wherever they found them and incorporate them into programs. The socialists had great hopes that electing Frank Zeidler mayor would revive what was clearly a badly failing socialist party.
That didn't happen, but Zeidler still made some major local changes.
Well, I think it's rather curious that the outstanding long-term result of his 12 years in office has been the annexation of more territory, enlarging of the city of Milwaukee, and he changed the character of politics, obviously, considerably in doing that. You wouldn't have expected that's where his thrust would be, though the socialists, as well as the non-socialists, had for a long time had a policy of trying to expand the area of Milwaukee.
During Zeidler's term in office, the Lake Michigan Harbor was developed. Milwaukee Public Museum and Arena were built. The public library was expanded. Housing projects were developed for low-income residents. He also worked for change on the national level, serving as his party's presidential candidate in 1976.
Frank ran pretty much for the what I would call basically a reformist platform, strong peace, anti-militarism, but concerned about nuclear affairs. When Frank ran in '76, obviously he didn't want to run, but this was an obligation that he would accept. You can twist a person's arm to a certain degree, and maybe he didn't need as much twisting as I would think, but I think it was an obligation to a party that had been, in a sense, kind to him. He had grown up with the party.
In 1995, Frank Zeidler received one of his many tributes as the municipal building was renamed in his honor. Built during his term, it houses many of the public service programs he believes are so important to city residents. As he has so often, Zeidler downplayed his role.
Little did I think when this building was being put up in 1958 and 59 that it ultimately would bear my name. I felt that when Mayor Norquist just announced that the building was bearing my name, the building shuddered a little bit.
Zeidler still lives in the central city with his wife in the home they bought in 1946. During a visit several years ago, he told me he's not about to stop speaking out on issues of peace and social justice.
Well, there are a lot of things to do in the community. You know, you just can't simply coast and think that things are going to be all right. You have to be participatory in all the kinds of things if you're going to have a decent community.
In 1997, the Humanities Room at the Central Library was dedicated to Zeidler, who credits the public library as a main source of his education, ideals, and civic policy. Few seem surprised at his continued involvement in activism in the community.
One of the things that holds you together when you get old, Frank's 3 years older than I am, one thing that holds you together, I think, is how good your mind is. And if you can manage to keep abreast of things, as he clearly does, he can survive. But you put your finger on what I think is the most remarkable thing about Zeidler. He's been out of office 40 years. He is still the first citizen of the city of Milwaukee. Clearly, the previous decades, I wouldn't have said there was a first citizen of Milwaukee. Perhaps in the 19th century, some of the industrialists thought they were. But he's the first citizen of Milwaukee. There's no question about that in my judgment. He was interested in the detail of administration and in the administration of government. And in that sense, he was in the job that above all he was suited for, namely municipal government.
Our present mayor, John Norquist, has said Zeidler was an active, dedicated, and inspiring leader in the community before his election, while he served, and that he still is. The two sat down several months ago to chat about the Zeidler years.
Well, I'm Mayor John Norquist of the City of Milwaukee, and it's a great joy to me to be talking with Mayor Frank Zeidler, who was mayor of Milwaukee from 1948 to 1960. And I thought I would, if you don't mind, we could talk a little partisan history.
Politics.
Little politics here. And you remember a time when you were young in high school or in grade school when the biggest parties in Milwaukee weren't necessarily the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but your own Socialist Party, plus you had the progressives here. That was an era, you know, I always get a kick out of it when people say, well, are you a Democrat? And yeah, I say yes. And they said, well, I suppose your party's dominated Milwaukee in the 20th century. And I say, well, no, the other party was in power 34 of the years in Milwaukee's 20th century. And they'll say, oh, the Republicans were in for 34 years. And I'll say, no, no, not the Republicans, the socialists. So anyway, what was it like? What was politics like when you had a big progressive party, big socialist party?
Well, I'll tell you something, John. That in 1928, when I was in high school and they had a presidential election, I spoke for Al Smith, Democrat. But when I was older, I elected to join the Socialist Party mainly because of its anti-war stand. I remembered the First World War and the tremendous anguish people had, and it occurred to me that the position of people like Norman Thomas of New York and Harry Zeidler and others who wrote on that subject were correct about protecting the future. The Socialist Party, however, in Milwaukee was never dominant except in the office of mayor and occasionally on the north side congressional district. The dominant force in Milwaukee from the time of the Civil War to the present, even despite the fact that the Civil War created a lot of Republicans, the dominant force was Democratic. And the reason it was Democratic was twofold. One was the Irish influence in Milwaukee was great. And the Irish were Democrats because the English stock people were Whigs or Republicans, and the Irish remember the Cromwell and the other devastation of Ireland produced by English rule. The Irish succeeded in convincing the German immigrants also to become Democrats, and the Germans were Democrats until some of them got prosperous when they moved over, became Republicans.
That's what Gaylord Nelson always told me, was that the Democratic Party was there to help people become rich enough so that they voted Republican.
Yeah. Well, that more or less happened. And then there were the progressive, the Polish immigrants that came here, who also leaned to become Democratic, maybe even partly because of their religion. And I don't say they were anti-Protestant, but largely because of their religious influence. Now, they were influential from at least 1898 to 1910 under the David Rose administration. The Rose administration, however, was not very ethical. And a lot of the fellows got indicted, and the socialist movement grew up as an opposition to that. The socialist movement was also based on German immigrants who brought over with them the labor ideas from Bismarck's time. Bismarck introduced certain measures to improve the conditions of the socialists because he wanted to counter the German Social Democratic Party. And these labor people brought that over.
So this would have been a tradition that traced itself back to people like Carl Schurz. Carl Schurz will probably later on was a Republican, and then he became a Democrat. But
there were earlier people. I suppose the tradition would best be represented by the Milwaukee Turners, which was something.
Which both you and I are members
yeah,
of.
Yeah, it was a little bit anti-clerical, but mostly it was staunchly democratic, even if, to the point of being afraid of a president who might become a king. But then there was this labor component with it. And it was out of the 8-hour day movement that the socialist movement arose together out of the populist movement. Now, the populist movement also started the progressive movement, which was a opposition inside the Republican Party to the domination of the Republican Party by the lumber barons and the railroads. And the progressive movement was reflected in the La Follette movement. That division between socialists and progressives allowed the Republicans to be, stalwart Republicans, to become dominant in the state, and the Democrats to become dominant in Milwaukee. It was only by an accident that the first socialist mayor, Emil Zeidler, got elected in 1910. There were 3 parties on the ballot: the Socialists, the Democrats, and the Republicans. The old Socialists were called Social Democrats. And Zeidler didn't get a majority, but he got a plurality. By 1912, the 2 other parties...
So he didn't have the majority, but he won by the rules as they existed.
Yeah.
Then what happened?
Then the 2 parties got legislative change to erase the party label in the county, in the city and county ballots, where you're elected 2 people at the end, whatever your origin. And the Republican and combined Republican and Democratic vote defeated Zeidler at the time. It didn't defeat Daniel W. Hone, who was the city attorney. Mm-hmm. Dan Hone was a fellow who got a law degree without having a high school degree. And he was a labor lawyer in Chicago and brought up here by Victor.
Just like Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, by Victor Berger. And somehow or other, he survived, and he survived again in 1914 and 1916. When the socialists run, he won.
So even though the Democrats and Republicans had changed the rules to block Zeidler from being reelected, 4 years later they ended up with a socialist mayor anyway.
They got an, but the socialist peak was between 1910 and 1912. They had a congressman, Victor Berger. They had a lot of people.
Now, Berger was elected from jail in World War I.
He was elected in 1920. 1920 and 22. He was sentenced for 25 years by Kennesaw Mountain Landis, that later on
the
czar. But he was then a federal judge, and the Supreme Court threw the case out.
He was against World War I, and that's what got him.
Yeah, he made some mild critical statements of the Wilson administration. He didn't make them himself. They were in his paper. They were written probably by John M. Work, the editor.
No, I looked in the old Wisconsin State Blue Books to see what the legislative composition was like. And right up until almost World War II, there were socialists elected to the state legislature. I think the last election was 1938, maybe.
But the Socialist Party went off the ballot in 1935 and 36. The State Federation of Labor demanded that the socialists get off the ballot because they were hurting a labor movement.
So the socialists basically were moving into the Democratic Party by that time.
No, they moved into the Progressive Party. And they were there, and then in 1941, the socialists split. The majority of them went into the Democratic Party. That included Hone and practically all the leadership.
And the
although
labor
one or
movement
two
socialists
became Republicans. And they infused a new life into the Democratic Party. And not only that, but they brought a new philosophy into the Democratic Party. In the 30s, the Democratic Party was more conservative, I shouldn't say conservative, almost reactionary as compared even to the Republican Party. But this new element that came in with the progressives and the socialists both went into the Democratic Party as a result of Franklin Roosevelt. And out of the progressive movement you came Gaylord Nelson, Pat Lucy, John Reynolds. They produced a new leadership. And in Milwaukee, underneath the reorganization of the Democratic ward units began to follow the socialist ward unit type of development.
Which was still the remnants of the Socialist Party by the time when you were elected mayor, open member of the Socialist Party. You were elected fairly substantially. You defeated Henry Royce, among others. Henry Meyer, I believe, may have even run it.
Henry Meyer ran at that time, too.
He finished 6th, I think.
Yeah.
And you won, and I ran into one of your, I don't remember their name, but I was going door to door down in Bayview back in 1987, and I ran into a guy who had been part of the organization, and he claimed that in the 1948 election that they were able to put out a literature drop for you on a Saturday morning and cover the whole city.
Yeah.
And that explains how you beat the Milwaukee Sentinel, which called you a communist, what, about 90 days in a row, something like that?
In 1956, the Sentinel called me a communist for many, many days. Sunday morning, they had a column and a half wide editorial, "Thank God we can still worship."
Yeah, right. So they, in 56, they didn't editorialize against you, I think, on Easter, as I remember.
Yeah.
And you sent him a letter thanking him for leaving you alone on Easter Day, something like that.
Well, but the socialist movement at that time was intermingled with the progressive movement very much. And then the progressive movement, as a movement, because of Franklin Roosevelt, went into the rank and file, went into the Democratic Party, but the La Follette brothers didn't. And when Robert M. Jr., La Follette Jr., ran in 46, he didn't have a following, and that's how Joe McCarthy beat him. But even then, he would have beat Joe McCarthy, except that Perry Stearns ran also in that primary.
And took away the progressive Republican
took
vote.
away enough votes from Robert La Follette to cause Joe McCarthy to get
Now, the coalition that you had, the political coalition that you had in the 3 terms that you were mayor, included organized labor for the most part. People
some
like
Democrats.
Jake Friedrich would have been a supporter of yours.
J.F. Friedrich. He was a great labor organizer.
He was one of the founders of the Milwaukee County Labor Council, and they would have been on your side at that time.
Well, the Milwaukee County Labor Council was a descendant of the Federated Labor Council, which existed. Inside the labor movement, there was, of course, a difference between trade unions, which would be like the electricians and the carpenters, and factory unions.
Were you more likely to get the factory unions than the trade unions, I suppose?
Well, the trade union was the original base of the Socialist Party, but when the Socialists nationally endorsed the CIO as an industrial type of union, the trade unions moved away.
You had the bulk of the big, like the Allied Industrial Workers, the United Auto Workers, and so forth.
Yeah, the industrial type union people were. However, we didn't have much money. I think I won that election with $26,000.
And even adjusted for inflation, that would probably be about $100,000. That's still not much compared to what it would be today.
I figure only 2 industrial people contributed in that campaign to our campaign.
Yeah. One question about that, though. Back in '56, did municipal government have unions at that point?
No, they started to organize, and they had meet and confer things. They had a government service league here, and the government leaders of the government service league would sit down with the common council and make up some kind of a thing. And school teachers had an education association where 2 women in the education association would sit down with Harry Meissner, who was the main boss in the school board when I was there, and then they'd make a deal of what they would do. So it was what they call meet and confer. But about 57 or 58, the public employees began to organize, particularly through the influence of Arnold Zander. I don't know if you ever knew Arnold.
He was one of the founders of AFSCME.
He was a founder of AFSCME. His father was Arnold Zander Sr. of Two Rivers, who was a socialist. Arnold Zander himself was a university guy, and he worked for the state of Wisconsin. He organized, I think, the AFSCME local. Then,
along with Wayne McGowan, the old Republican administrator.
They followed pretty much the CIO type of organizing and began to organize. And by 1959, it became necessary to start not only meeting and conferring, but entering into a contract. Entering into a contract with police and fire unions occurred much later.
Mm-hmm.
But, that was a no-no at that time.
Well, if you look at municipal politics now, probably the biggest single players would be the municipal unions.
Yeah.
And
well,
that was something that you didn't exist at all.
Well,
when you
public
were
unions are the biggest kind of unions there are now.
Yeah.
Although the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, is getting to be pretty big. But all the other types of unions have more or less declined. And some of the unions have become clearly Republican in character.
I've noticed that occasionally.
Yeah.
The governor of the state of Wisconsin picks up a few supports from that. Well, getting back to the period between 1948 and 1960, one of the big battles that you fought, and Dan Hone had fought it back in the 1930s, was trying to save the streetcar company. It had been an asset of the electric company, an asset they didn't want, so they unloaded it, and it ended up in financial trouble. You had both the interurban system and the streetcar system. That happening, and then the very same time the federal government suddenly spending huge sums of money on highways. It must have been a frustrating period to try to save transit when the federal government wasn't funding anything like that and only funding highways.
Yeah.
And you must have been pretty much a lone voice. Did you have any big allies in that fight?
They had no allies. They had allies in streetcar buffs. You know, people who were
streetcar drivers, I suppose, wanted to keep
No,
it.
even they weren't, but streetcar buffs, people who liked the transit system. But it was, in the transit system, the Wisconsin Electric Power Company, or its predecessor, TMER&L Company, as it was correct, as you said, they wanted to get rid of that system. It was to them, it was a headache. So they sold it to a private operator. Ultimately, it came under a fellow named Fred Johnson. And there was another thing. They began to take the streetcar tracks up because they didn't want to pay the taxes on them, and people also were gravitating toward buses. They wouldn't extend streetcar lines anymore. They were only extending bus lines. And the idea of riding a bus was superior socially than riding a streetcar. The last streetcar line was the Wells streetcar line. If I were back in your office, I'd try to put it back in.
Yeah, right. I've been trying to do that.
It went from Lake Park out to the county institutions and to West Allis, and it was a very good line. They took it up in 1958.
I've seen the picture.
Yeah, they took it up in
there was an alderman standing there near you who I met later, George Widow.
Yeah,
George. Who was probably not one of your biggest supporters.
No, George Widow was there. We tried to save that line. The biggest losses were in the interurban system. The interurban system, the electric company sold the interurban system to, I think Greyhound was one of the owners of it one time, and then somehow or other they disposed of it, and it came into the hands of a fellow from Cleveland named J. Maeder, M-A-E-D-E-R, who never operated a system in his life, but paid $110 for it, and got $110 and got that system, and operated it with a fellow named Ed Templeton, something like that, who was a operator of a system in Pittsburgh. The line had two major accidents. One occurred near Soldiers Home, where two cars were running eastbound, and one car overran Soldiers Home and backed up to pick a passenger and got hit by the second car, which overrode it. That was a catastrophic, but nobody got killed in that one. Then J. Maeder was taking, in 1951, he was taking a group of model railroad friends brought here by Al Kalmbach, who had Trains Magazine, and he had them out near Hales Corners at where about National Avenue crosses, and a car comes, he and another guy were on a single line, and he sees this other car coming over the top of the hill. He stops his car and gets out, and the other car crashes and kills 10 people. That bankrupted the line. In the Lloyds of London, nobody would
Insure 'em
secure
at
it.
that point.
Bruno Bitker offered that to the city of Milwaukee for $600,000. But the harbor director, who was very influential with the council, he persuaded the council not to go for it.
Yeah,
And as I've said before, now they're offering to rebuild it at $22 million a mile.
yeah.
Then
Which
the,
is still cheaper than highways.
Yeah.
We just built the Lake South Arterial,
Yeah.
and it's the state paid $80 million a mile for
Yeah.
that one. So
it's
the highways aren't free either, I guess.
it's very costly. The other day I saw a truck saying paving company. I thought of an unpaving company.
Yeah.
Start an unpaving business.
Well, we're doing that with our school playgrounds now.
Yeah.
We have something called Greening Milwaukee, where our forestry department is now taking some of the asphalt off playgrounds and putting grass and dirt back.
Great.
Because the kids are less likely to get hurt on grass and dirt.
Yeah,
The reason that was changed, I guess, was because the custodian could sweep up the glass easier if it was pavement. But on the other hand, the bottles
No,
wouldn't break.
I don't even think they ever thought about that. Everything was pavement, and
Just pave it to pave it.
yeah, just go with them.
My time of interviewing you has expired, but I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Maybe we can do another session later.
Sure.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.